the idea around 120 grams, yeah, like there's a bit of a push-pull. The fact that everyone's pulled towards 120 grams, like, I realize there's no research around that. There's nothing to support that at the moment. In fact, if we were to dip into the research, intakes above 100 grams, actually, there's a negative correlation there. Like, performances start to dip when we start to go over 100 grams an hour. So
Paul, I'm very excited about this conversation because not only are you an exercise physiologist and sports performance nutritionist with Salomon International Team, but you're also a PhD researcher who formulated the fueling plan for Tom Evans and Ruth Croft, both of whom won the men's and women's category of the 2025 UTMB 100-mile race. So correct me if any of my information is not correct, but my understanding is that with Tom, you took his hourly carb intake down, but with Ruth, you actually brought it up. And interestingly, you landed around 90 to 94 grams of carbs per hour for both Tom and Ruth, and they both won UTMB. Now, with Tom, you had him in the lab to determine his fueling needs based on race simulations. Can you walk me through what that testing actually looked like and what it told you that you couldn't have known any other way?
yeah. So great question to start with. I mean, in some respects, getting Tom in the lab, like the data that we produced was really, really useful in terms of informing the race, but also it acted as a crutch. It gave me quite a lot of confidence in terms of what I was doing, what I was delivering, what I was changing, simply because to kind of take a step back with both those athletes from a professional perspective, they both had a certain brief. So Tom had tried and failed twice previously to win UTMB, and he's certainly got the, well, as we know now, he's definitely got the potential to win it.
Yeah.
So he came to me and he said, look, like, I've attempted this. It's not worked both times. And I feel like my issues have been with nutrition. So his brief was, look, I need something different. I don't want to go as high as 120 grams an hour, which a lot of people are obviously doing at the moment. Because he said, I
Yeah.
feel that's my problem. So we were kind of stepping back a little bit. So it's like, it was, okay, he wants to run an aggressive race. He wants to win, but we're not going to dial it in on 120 grams. We're going to go lower. Then with Ruth, it was kind of the opposite. Again, easily got the capacity to win UTMB, but she was taking a lot less in terms of carbohydrates per hour. But her brief was to go more aggressive this year, last year, sorry, make a faster start. So with Ruth, we actually went a little bit higher to enable to make sure she had that carbohydrate availability there, to have that higher intensity, particularly at the start. So with both of them, the gamble was, it was going higher with Ruth and thinking, okay, if we go higher, then what that usually does is bring in some issues around like gut motility, GI distress, things like that as well. And then with Tom, we're going to go down. So actually, are we reducing carbohydrate availability there? So once I'd kind of looked at the course, I'd gone through a lot of their data. I'd looked at heart rate data from previous years. I'd delved really deep into their training peaks and looked at data from other races. Basically, as much as I could get. I'd looked at their competitors as well and things like that. Really kind of broke it down. And I thought, well, actually, yeah, it's achievable purely because the idea around 120 grams, yeah, like there's a bit of a push-pull from being a practitioner in the fact that everyone's pulled towards 120 grams. But actually, as a researcher, like, I realize there's no research around that. There's nothing to support that at the moment. In fact, if we were to dip into the research to look at taking intakes above 100 grams, actually, when we look at the dose response research and the performance research, actually there's a negative correlation there. Like, performances start to dip when we start to go over 100 grams an hour. So it's this weird kind of dichotomy about what do I do? Do I go with this trend, or do I kind of go with the research? So the answer to that was to get Tom in the lab and just do as much testing as possible. So we could break that down and really look at Tom's carbohydrate oxidation, his fat oxidation, to see, firstly, how much he could actually oxidize. It's pointless giving someone 120 grams if they're not going to oxidize anywhere near that. We could also look at the intensity he was going to run at UTMB to see if the demand was there for that amount of carbohydrates. Look at his fat oxidation as well, to look at, again, like how his endogenous substrate usage was going to, like, in terms of carbohydrates, glycogen use, fat use. And then also his VO2 max, his lactate threshold, really to look at the intensities that he'd be running UTMB at. And from that, it gave me a lot of confidence in the fact that on his first lab visit, like just with some basic tests, like we realized he was one of the highest fat burners we've ever seen. Like just like a fasted run, he was, I think it managed to score about 1.35 grams of fat per minute. And then
And this is with carbohydrates.
Yeah, no, that was like fasted, so it was in the morning. So he'd skip. So he'd done a carb load the day before, but he'd skipped breakfast.
Okay.
And then we got him back in a glycogen depleted state to simulate a little bit more what it would look like in terms of how he would be running at UTMB. But we fed him carbs at that point, and actually at that point he went up, and that was a much longer run. That was over like 5 hours. His fat oxidation actually went up to very close to 1.5 grams a minute.
Okay.
So actually, like in terms of his energy needs per minute, he was meeting like probably 70% of those through fat oxidation. So already we knew that, like in terms of his overall carbohydrate oxidation, essentially to kind of plug that gap, we certainly didn't need to go very high. And then once we factored in the intensity he'd be running at, his VO2 max, his lactate threshold, things like that, how hard he was going to hit the climbs, we could dial it in. I was quite confident that we didn't need to go up to 120 grams. And then with both Tom and Ruth, we worked for a long time really hard on making sure the guts could tolerate like high amounts of carbs, even though we weren't going to go up to 120 grams. We made sure that they were both safe at 120 grams. And then during the race, we could back off. So we had that little buffer, and it worked on both counts. So there was times when we did go higher, but there's also times when we went lower. So we mapped out UTMB, defined it in terms of kind of put an intensity profile on there, and really looked at the points where carbohydrate oxidation would increase the most. So we made sure that at those points, both athletes had the best carbohydrate availability. So we would boost carbohydrate intakes up roughly kind of 60 to 120 minutes before that to reach peak oxidation at those points. And we might go as high as 110 grams an hour. But again, that might only be for a block of a couple of hours. And then we'd drop right down maybe to 80 grams. So that overall average of, say, 90 to 94 grams an hour, you know, that was just the mean average right across the race.
In the lab, was Tom's exogenous oxidation rate for carbohydrates about 60 grams per hour?
Yeah, roughly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so
if that's the case, and if he's taking 90 to 94 grams on average across 19 hours at UTMB, so there's a 35 grams difference, right? Between what he's consuming and what he's actually oxidizing. So over 19 hours, that's probably close to 0.5 kilogram of carbohydrates. Where does that go in his body?
So take a step back. So his oxidation rates, so we're doing a mix of glucose and fructose. We did that at a 1 to 0.8 ratio. So more glucose and fructose in there. Yeah, so over that time, I mean, there's a few different things, and we looked at different intensities as well. But again, like his oxidation rates kind of, actually his oxidation rates got quite high, higher than some research that I've seen. But other times what we realized is because his VO2 max was so high and his lactate threshold was so high, that sometimes the demand wasn't as great at certain points. So actually sometimes that'd come right down just because that intensity wasn't there. So he's peaking quite high, still not enough that he would need 120 grams. But from some of those numbers, we're able to make sure that we'd done a kind of personalized nutrition plan for him to make sure that we're meeting peak oxidation at the right times. And then, kind of going back to your question, that those other areas that want to oxidize kind of carbohydrates, I mean, that's a big question that a lot of people are asking at the moment. So it's whether they hang around the gut and just don't get oxidized, or whether there's malabsorption and people are just able to tolerate those a little bit more. Well, the liver might take up a little bit more. So essentially you're stopping any kind of glycogen breakdown from the liver. So you're protecting liver glycogen, things like that.
Does any go into the muscle as glycogen?
Yeah, exactly. It could
Okay.
also be that glycogen is being stored in other muscle tissue as well.
Okay.
And
Okay.
it could even be the fact that at the points when his intensity is much lower, or at the points when he's stopping at aid stations, things like that, some of those carbohydrates are actually going to get stored as glycogen as well.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
there's still going to be quite a big difference in there, but we were working on the fact that we were trying to reduce that difference as much as possible. So he wouldn't have to take loads of additional gels. And again, he's going to be running for 20 hours. And a lot of the
Hmm.
research, even the research that says high carbohydrate intakes are tolerated really well, most of that research is like 3, maximum 4 hours. A lot of the time it's a different modality, so it's on the bike. So that just doesn't map across to high
Yeah.
carbohydrate intakes over 20 hours. So in the forefront of our mind was making sure that like he didn't get any GI issues, because that would also affect his performance. And it's affected his performance so badly in previous years that he's had
Yeah.
to withdraw from a race. So these are all kind of the things that are in balance. So we wanted to make sure that it was personalized as much as possible for Tom.
And you got it spot on.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And again, the fact is, like, we might have been able to go in with a little bit less, but we
Okay.
trained him to be able to take that much, and we knew we were really safe with that. So we were able to go in with a lot of confidence. And actually, having that confidence as well is likely to reduce GI issues. It's just
Yeah.
removing a layer of anxiety. And again, if you go into a race with high anxiety and that's piling up from loads and loads of different things, and one of those could be thinking, "Oh my gosh, is my gut going to go south at some point during this race?" Then actually, your gut is prone to kind of get more gut issues. I always think if you go to any race and look at the queues for the toilet before the race, you won't
Yeah.
get that on a normal day. It's the fact that that's a little bit of that anxiety before
Yeah.
pre-race nerves for people, and this happens all the way through the race. So yeah, I mean, also what I've seen working with elites and talking to elites as well, and what the most amazing thing is, I've seen so many people set and break records on actually a hell of a lot less carbohydrates than that. Not everybody is doing 120 grams an hour or more, and a lot of people are doing like, in fact, a lot less than recommendations at the moment, which are 90 grams an hour.
Yeah.
So I kind of took a little bit from that as well. I was quite confident in the fact that people are doing amazing things on a lot less.
Yeah.
Not that I'm saying people should take a lot less, because actually some of those amazing things might be even better if people took more carbs. But I think there's a balance between going too low and going too high. And for me, that's roughly around those current recommendations, which are 90 grams an hour.
The Goldilocks zone.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. How were those carbs delivered during the race to Tom and Ruth? Was it gels or was it a sports drink or was it a combination of both?
Yeah, a combination of both. So,
Okay. Okay.
so in the race, interestingly, we did put some solid foods out for Tom at aid stations, but he didn't really touch those.
Okay.
Ruth didn't touch any solid foods at all during the race. So it
Okay.
shows that actually you can get through and win like a major ultra like UTMB and not take on any solid food. So gels and drinks all the way. I mean, we had rice and we had different bars available, and
Yeah.
both of them took on a couple of kind of bars, energy bars, but that was
Yeah.
basically it. So the bulk
Okay.
was certainly gels and drinks. And at any one point, each athlete would have 2 drinks, occasionally 3 drinks, depending on the duration between checkpoints.
Mhm.
One drink in sort of 500 ml, 600 ml flasks. One drink would be high carbohydrate, usually around 80 grams, and then the other would usually just be plain water.
Okay.
So we'd always do a little mix. So you'd have an
Sorry, 80
80,
grams per 500 milliliters. Is
yeah,
that okay?
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So you'd have that 80 grams in one drink, which would often be quite strong, super sweet. But then you'd have the other bottle, which was a bit of a palate cleanser. So if there's a
Yeah.
time when that athlete might be on the drink, on the bottle, which could be on more technical sections or sections which would be more difficult. So for Tom, for example, when we're chatting afterwards, he was saying the drinks were really, really good because there's certain sections where it was really technical. It was night. He had his poles on, he had gloves on, he had to really concentrate. It was snowing. There's no way in the world he could have got a gel out of his pocket and opened it. But with a drink there, he can reach down and
Just
take
suck.
a drink. And at other times when he is taking gels or bars or whatever it may be, he can just take on the water at that time. So there's a little bit of variability and a little bit of change in there as well, which helps us meet our targets kind of for each hour, but also sort of for each block that we've sort of chunked the race down into.
Let's try to translate all that we just talked about to a recreational, non-elite ultra runner that's listening, right? So say someone is doing a 50 to 80K mountain trail race. And for them, an average time on feet would be perhaps 8 to 15 hours, nowhere close to as fast as Tom or Ruth. And they don't have a crew. They're carrying most of their own nutrition needed for the race and perhaps relying a bit on the aid stations. Without their access to you or a lab to test their carbohydrate oxidation rate, they have no way of knowing that. So how do they figure out how much carbohydrate they actually need to consume? Would they just go with recommendation, or is there a practical rule of thumb they can use to assess their needs without a lab?
Yeah. And I mean, the lab is a luxury. And again, sometimes I question whether people really need the lab, because again, we're only ever working within small margins. So some people say, oh, should I take 90 or 100 grams out with me? And I'm like, well, when we break that down, it's really very small and you might not actually see any significant difference in there at all. So again, like with amateur athletes, and it's not to say that amateur athletes don't need like high carbohydrates, depending, because again, amateurs can still run fast, burn a lot of calories per hour, but it depends on rates of fatigue. It depends how fast they're going. It depends on that intensity, things like that. So again, for most amateurs, it's what that starting point is. So I always kind of test out your gut and think about what that athlete can actually tolerate during like per hour. If people can take on like 60 grams an hour, that's a good starting point. And I recommend that to anybody. Again, it's testing out on long runs or smaller races or things like that. But it's also figuring out how your race is going to be. So are you going to be walking a lot of it? How high is your heart rate going to go? So it's easy to work that out in terms of calories per minute. And then you can look at that intensity and work out in terms of what you feel like your oxidation rates would be, in terms of, what percentage of VO2 max might you be running at. And from what I see, people quite often start off really fast at sort of 75%, but often quite drops down to kind of 60%. And for Tom and Ruth, they were in the 50s at one point, which is kind of really low for those. And they were just kind of cruising along at that. So a real kind of fat burning zone. So it depends on how well trained that athlete is, what their goals for the race are. The longer the race, like the likely it is that that pace is going to drop. So I think a baseline would always be 60 grams an hour. And then for an amateur, if they're going fast, and let's say it's a 50K race, and they think, right, I'm going to give this some, then actually 90 grams an hour would be a really good target. But more than likely, people could get away with 75 grams an hour. Anything longer, like if an amateur was doing like a UTMB style race,
like 100-mile.
That might potentially take an amateur athlete anywhere between 23, 24, all the way up to 40,
30 hours.
42 hours. Over that time, nutrition might change considerably, and it might well be that there's large chunks where somebody's walking, where carbohydrate needs are not going to be as great, but actually they're going to get hungry because they're out there for 2 days. So probably take on more real food, like bread, ham, cheese, which are all available at UTMB aid stations. Exactly. There's times when they might even have a nap and a little sleep. So again, it all depends on that. The gut might be able to tolerate that a little bit more because the intensity is not as high. But as soon as that intensity starts to go up in a short race, then actually you're piling on duration, which is likely to increase GI issues. You're piling on intensity as well, which is going to increase GI issues. There's going to be changes to thermoregulation as well, which is going to pile on those GI issues. So if you start to have real foods which are going to slow down gastric emptying, that's going to exacerbate that even more. So again, depending on the level of the athlete, like that nutrition plan's probably going to change quite significantly.
I really like your framework of playing it safe that you mentioned earlier, training the gut to be able to tolerate more and consume a little bit more than necessary, but below the level of what you train your gut to tolerate. That made a lot of sense for me, like training at 120 grams per hour, but then consuming 90 grams per hour, but when you only need 75 to 80. So you have that buffer on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit that's not my idea. That's what I'm taking from the research. So that was from a paper with a lead author of Ricardo Costa on it from Monash University in Australia, who are basically the world leaders on. If anyone's interested in like gut training and GI issues during running, all the research that comes out there is absolutely brilliant. And yeah, that kind of came from that. But I've found that works really well. Again, that buffer zone, because a lot of people go, right, I want to take 90 grams an hour. So they'll go out and do a few runs where they take 90 grams an hour. And again, that will certainly help. But actually, we want to push that even further.
Beyond.
So we're able just to back off a little bit.
Yeah, so you have a delta of buffer.
Exactly. And it really works. See, we just see like even after a short period of time, I see the benefits of that.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You mentioned VO2 max just now. So let me throw a layer of complexity into what we just discussed by painting a hypothetical scenario. So say we have an elite runner and a recreational runner. Both are running 100K ultra at say 70% of their VO2 max. The elite is obviously producing dramatically more power and going at a much faster pace at the same metabolic intensity, assuming all variables are equal, especially their fat to carbohydrate oxidation ratio, which means that they're burning the same percentage of fats to the same percentage of carbs at 70% VO2 max. Does the requirement for carbohydrate per hour in absolute grams differ for these two athletes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, with that as well, it depends where they run in terms of like their LT1. So again, first lactate threshold, what you would usually see is like roundabout there or shortly after. For most people, if you were to plot that on a graph, fat oxidation just falls off a cliff and carbohydrate oxidation will go up. So again, round about that 70%, that could well like be the mark where LT1 is. So there might be a difference between the elite and the amateur, or it could go either way. So again, it might depend on how much fat they're oxidizing at that point. But I would certainly say if, like for Tom, for example, compared to me, when I looked at this, there's times when I'm running at that pace where I'm burning only like 12 calories a minute. But when I look at him, he's burning around about 16 or 17. So yeah, so those metabolic demands
at the same VO2 max percentage.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So those metabolic demands are certainly going to go up. Again, that energy gap needs to be plugged. Like with the difference is what I see between him and maybe some amateurs. He's plugging that gap a lot more through fat oxidation as well. But like if he's going to go high, yeah, certainly his carbohydrate needs are going to go up. But even with that, we're always going to reach a plateau in terms of what those oxidation rates are, regardless of whether it's an amateur runner or an elite runner. And again, in the scientific literature, that kind of, in terms of where that plateau lies, that's usually about 65 to 70% VO2 max. So above that, even though demands might be greater, there's still a chance that those peak oxidation rates are not going to go any higher than that for any level of runner, if that makes sense. So in the lab, if we were going to test this in terms of those oxidation rates, we would expect to see oxidation rates meet their peak oxidation rates at roughly about kind of 2 hours, possibly to kind of 2.5 hours. But that's usually that point where we would see it. And then at that point, we get a good understanding of what those peak oxidation rates are. And again, that's a point when you're going to start seeing glycogen deplete more.
When you say peak oxidation rates, are you talking peak oxidation rates for fat or for glycogen?
Well, peak exogenous oxidation rates. So in terms of
what's consumed?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, in the real world, elites are obviously like oxidizing significantly more fat than amateurs, right? Because of numerous factors, mitochondrial density, training volume, and all that. So for a recreational runner, at the same intensity, their fat burning capacity is smaller. So does that mean that they should actually be a bit more dependent on carbohydrates?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've thought about this a lot actually.
Okay.
And again, it's like people often dismiss amateurs and say, oh, because they're not running at the same intensity, they don't need the same amount of carbohydrates. But yeah, you're right. As I say, like a lot of elites. So again, if we look at Tom, he's got really high VO2 max. He's got really high lactate threshold. LT1 and LT2. So actually, that relative intensity, even though he's running fast and he's winning, relatively, he's actually running at a lower percent of VO2 max. Whereas an amateur might be running at a much higher percentage. So again, they're going to be much more dependent on carbohydrates. So yeah, I
Even though
would
they're going a
say
lot slower.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the fact that I'd say the only difference is over time, like he's much more durable and he's able to maintain that pace more, and actually at times even pull it out the bag and increase that pace and increase intensity later on. Whereas an amateur, what I tend to see a lot is they will fatigue much sooner and drop off quite a lot earlier. So again, like in some of my work in the field, where even in 50K races or simulated 50K events, where
Mhm.
people have started at 75% VO2 max, by the time they end that, they've dropped down to kind of 55 to 60% VO2 max. The better athletes are able to sustain kind of 65% VO2 max of that. So that's a difference. Like if we were to take a snapshot at a single point in time early on, then those two things are pretty much level in terms of that carbohydrate oxidation. But later on, as fatigue sets in, the elite is more likely carrying a higher load than the amateur just because they're not as affected by that level of fatigue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so they're not so limited by the muscular side of the fatigue, right? Because that's what slows a lot of people down.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the
Yeah.
thing. So if we look at Ruth's race at UTMB from 2024, I think her race in the second half from Courmayeur was like she had the fastest splits ever, and that's because
Okay.
the first half was quite conservative, but you can see the intensity there, and her pace was huge in the second half, which shows okay she backed off a bit in the first half, but actually she was improving all the way through. Whereas most people, she was making a lot of time because actually at the same time, most people were starting to fatigue more there as well.
Hmm.
So again, I think that's a difference when we look at amateurs to elites, just that overall durability.
Yeah, I guess it's really hard to really pinpoint exactly what's one person's individual needs without knowing your fat oxidation rate and your intensity that you're going to be running at mile 50 as compared to mile 10, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, the
yeah.
way we bank on that is a bit like Tom and Ruth, where we kind of looked that all the way through and we'd looked at that historic data from there. So the easiest way to do that was to go back to what it's saying and play it safe and make sure that we're getting enough to meet their peak
Mm,
oxidation all the way through, particularly later on in the race
yeah.
when glycogen depletion is going to be a major challenge. And again, it might well be that like we try and I mean, what I was trying to do with each athlete was actually increase carbohydrate intake a little bit more towards the end, because that's the point when fatigue sets in. It's a point when people drop off eating. That's also the point when you're able to make a break as well.
Okay,
And some
yeah.
people are just unable to respond either respond to a breakaway or to make a break just because they've not got the carbohydrate availability at that point. They're just not able to dig deep enough to increase that ATP turnover at that point. So I think that's again changing our methodology a little bit later in the race as well, just to increase that a little bit more there, just to make sure that we're trying to offset fatigue as much as possible through feeding.
Do you think that there is an element of that higher carbohydrate later on in the race that helps in stimulating the brain? Because we've seen research of people washing their mouths with a carbohydrate drink towards the end of a marathon, and it puts them into a bit of overdrive, right? Do you think that that could be an effect of that higher carbohydrate later on in the race as well to help the brain reduce the fatigue that is perceiving?
Yeah, like yes and no. Um,
Okay.
yes, in terms of that stimulatory effect, the effect on the central nervous system. Yeah,
Mm,
that's definitely there. And there's some previous research that said that that is only effective once someone's in a glycogen depleted state. So
okay.
actually, like for these athletes, they're definitely going to be in a glycogen depleted state. So that will work. There's some more recent research that actually says that counters that and says actually it works regardless. So yeah,
Okay.
so that really works. But my answer no to that is the fact that like does the amount really make any difference in the fact that like that sensory perception is actually from swilling it and using receptors in your mouth and throat. So
Yeah.
why would that see any difference in the amount of carbohydrates in there unless that will also look at essentially the energy content of that um, or even the osmolality of it. I'm not sure if that
Hmm.
would make a specific difference, but that could be the only difference there, like rather than the actual whether it's 90 or 120 grams. I'm not too sure. So there's probably a bit of scope for research in that. And from my own research that's as yet unpublished, I'm not seeing any difference in that at all.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, it's an idea that people have kind of framed, um, but I just don't think there's legs in it at all. Because
Okay.
I think a major challenge as well is the fact that in the field, no one's really done any tests blinded. So in ultra running in particular, all of a sudden we've just gone from people taking nowhere near enough fuel on board, like nowhere, like much less than the recommended dose of 90 grams. And a lot of people are actually still taking a lot less of that than that. And then a lot of people have already jumped onto 120, 140. So somewhere along the way, they're getting the right dose. And they're going, wow, this is amazing. Like, because they're feeding correctly and they're just able to tolerate the rest. But they've gone from nothing to everything. If we dial it back a little bit, we'll go back to finding what we were talking about at the start of this conversation is finding that sweet spot.
Yeah, that's the spot. Yeah, yeah. In the middle of the barbell, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah. You mentioned osmolality a short while ago, and in preparation for this conversation, I looked at the carbohydrate content of gels that major sports nutrition brands offer on the market right now, and it ranges from as low as 50% concentration up to about 80% concentration. And when I say concentration, I'm talking about the amount of carbohydrates in relation to the volume of the gel or to the weight of the gel, right? Which means that even on the low end, these gels are very hypertonic. In other words, they have a higher osmolality than blood, right? And that slows gastric emptying. It causes water to be drawn from the bloodstream into the gut lumen. And of course, the downstream effects of that is GI distress, and that can manifest in many different ways that we don't really have to go into detail here. But a lot of athletes are still able to tolerate that high level of carbohydrates with a hypotonic fuel or fluid, right? How much of that tolerance do you think is due to the athlete training the gut versus chasing the gel with consumption of water or an electrolyte beverage?
Yeah, a bit of both. But yeah, certainly. And just going back onto that, I'm always amazed by it in the fact that like years and years of research around gastric emptying and osmolality and everything we kind of thought around that, like GI distress, all of a sudden, in the space of a couple of short years, went out the window, and people are just taking on like insane amounts and actually not getting gut issues. I mean, some people are still getting serious gut issues, but yeah, a lot of that comes hand in hand with the knowledge we've got now around gut training for sure, and being able to tolerate that. But I also think the sort of second part of your question is probably the fact that like people are taking on a little bit more fluid now as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's odd that people aren't getting like major GI distress a lot more.
Okay.
Maybe people are, they're just not mentioning it quite as much. But it might also be the fact that gels have changed as well a little bit more. And actually, like we're using more maltodextrin as well, which is going to have a lower osmolality. Yeah, the dextrose equivalent of those, like I think for maltodextrin, that range is anywhere between 3 and 20. So it
Yeah.
depends on the quality of of maltodextrin that someone's using. So if it's lower in terms of dextrose equivalent, then actually it's going to have a lower osmolality as well. So it could be potentially that, whereas older formulations might actually use a lot more glucose, which is going to have a higher osmolality and actually potentially cause more gut distress. So again, I think all these things, rather than just one thing, it's multifactorial. I think all these kind of things come into it. But I'd definitely say at the top of that tree would be sitting like gut tolerance more than anything, and gut training.
Yeah, you mentioned the dextrose equivalent of maltodextrin. So I also did some research prior to this conversation. And what I found out is around a dextrose equivalent of 10 is a sweet spot for having the lowest osmotic potential, while the carbohydrate chains are not so long that they are insoluble. Do you think that is a good dextrose equivalent for maltodextrin?
Yeah,
That
definitely.
is safe.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
about 10.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, a lot of people are actually changing a little bit now as well. So I do consulting work for Ministry Nutrition, and they're actually changing some of their products to put more cyclic dextrin in, which has got even lower dextrose equivalent than that, just to lower the osmolality even more, just to make it more
Did you say
tolerable.
cyclic dextrin?
Yeah, so like
What's
highly
that?
branched chain cyclic dextrin. It's
Okay.
basically it's just another form of glucose,
Okay.
which has a lower osmolality even than maltodextrin. The
Okay.
difference with that is it increases gastric emptying, so it clears from the gut faster, which potentially, so again, anything that's going to sit in your gut longer has got more chance of creating GI issues. So the more we load up the gut, like the more it's going to sit there, like it could create those upper GI issues that people often get. So actually, if we can clear that out and oxidize that faster, it's going to be much better. We're going to get that energy faster. With cyclic dextrin, clears from the gut faster, but actually it oxidizes slightly slower. So for longer races, it could have a kind of dual effect in terms of it's slightly lower in terms of it's got a really high oxidation efficiency. Actually, it's a bit slower release, but actually that slower release doesn't come from slower release from the gut, if that makes sense. Whereas something with like higher energetic equivalent would be slower release from the gut. I think off the top of my head, I'm sure that the gut can only release about 2.1 kilocalories per minute in terms of it, like into the like lower intestines. Someone might want to change that if I'm wrong. So this is kind of the sort of thing we're looking at, whether in the real world it makes any kind of difference, because there's not a hell of a lot of research around that at the moment. So again, like manufacturing processes are sort of changing around to this a little bit, but again, that costs more in terms of those products to buy in.
Earlier, you mentioned that Tom and Ruth are using a 1:0.8 ratio of glucose to fructose, right? A lot of brands are still using the 2:1 fructose ratio. Some brands now are, I wouldn't say, promoting the 1:0.8, and you seem to be more of an advocate for the 1:0.8. At what point does the ratio actually start to matter in terms of how much carbohydrate intake per hour would that ratio matter? Say between 60 grams per hour, 100 grams per hour, in excess of 120 grams per hour?
Yeah, so with Tom and Ruth, like we kind of changed it around a little bit, and obviously part of that was dependent upon their sponsors as well. And actually, I think under the kind of 90 grams an hour, it probably doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference. But but over 90 grams an hour, then yeah, it will for sure. There's kind of really good research out there by like Wendy O'Brien and David Rowlands that found like the perfect ratios that they were kind of going back to what saying about sweet spot ratio, which was thinking about, right, what's the best ratio of fructose to glucose. So they found that actually on a curve of sort of 0.8 to 1 to 1, that increased overall oxidation, it increased performance as well, and actually it
Okay.
increased gut comfort. So again, some of those
Got it.
performance values might be, and actually in terms of fluid absorption as well. So again, like they found that, and that was taking in 108 grams an hour, so above 90 grams an hour.
Okay. Okay.
So that works well because actually, and I built a little calculator actually that I've got in front of me to work all this out. Because
Okay.
if I look at that, working on a basis of 69.4 grams of glucose an hour and 38.6
Okay.
grams of glucose an hour. So in the research, what we've seen is glucose in terms of glucose transporters, SGLT1 in the gut, they're going to plateau. That's going to peak at anywhere between 60 and 70 grams. So
Yeah, I
the
think so.
average is
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
1.1 grams a minute. But actually, what I've seen in the lab and other people have seen in the lab, and the recent IJAZ study, they found kind of rates up to sort of 70 grams an hour. So we can
Of
relatively say
glucose.
that, yeah. So
Okay.
if we're saturating SGLT1 at roughly about 70 grams per hour, and then we're topping up with fructose, then actually,
Which
yeah,
is GLUT5,
which is,
right?
yeah, just under 40, so 38.6 grams an hour, just under 40 grams, then actually we're able to increase oxidation rates through fructose a little bit more, rather than, like, if we were to change that ratio to, let's say, 2.1, then actually we're taking on 72 grams of glucose and
Glucose.
less fructose. So there's
Yeah.
some research from my lab at Leeds Beckett University, and the lead author on that was Andy King. When they looked at higher rates at 2-to-1 ratio, actually in a time trial, performance suffered, because what they noticed was actually glycogen depletion was faster early on, because what the mechanism to that, like they kind of drew it down to an overload effect from
Okay.
taking on too much glucose. So if we think, okay, let's saturate that at roughly 60 to 70 grams and then top up with fructose, then actually those ratios are going to make a major difference. If we're going over 90 grams an hour, if we're going up to 90 grams an hour, like potentially that 2-to-1 ratio is going to work best, because that would be 60 grams of glucose to 30 grams of fructose.
Yeah.
But even then, you could work on a different ratio, which could be 20 grams of, 70 grams of glucose to 20 grams
Glucose.
of fructose, even. Like, there's different ratios that people might not have changed so far, just
Yeah.
from what we know of the research at the moment, and that saturation of SGLT1. And then obviously there's kind of 1-to-1 as well, which more people are doing, which would be, if you were to take on 120 grams, then obviously it's going to be 60 grams of glucose to 60 grams of
60.
fructose,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
again works really well.
Is there a limit to how much the liver can oxidize the fructose with the GLUT5 transporters?
Yeah, it's a good question, and nobody really knows. But what
Okay.
what research has tended to show is, as soon as that like that 1-to-1 balance goes in the favor of fructose, people report much more GI issues, and actually oxidation efficiency drops even more. So
Okay.
you're
Okay.
oxidizing less of that. So the research and in the field now, people have tended to max out at that 1-to-1. So
Okay.
again, I see
Okay.
loads of people all the time saying, oh, well, the maximum we can oxidize is 60 grams of glucose per hour and 30 grams of fructose an hour. And that's completely wrong. Like, there's over 20 years of research which shows that we're able to oxidize more than that. And as I say, we're probably able to oxidize up to, particularly for some people, 70 grams of glucose, and potentially even the same for fructose.
Okay.
But the major question is, does that improve anything? Like, does that improve performance? And the
Yeah.
research so far has failed to show any difference. In fact, the only research that's published at the moment has shown that performance actually degrades above that. And I'm right in the middle of writing it up, where we did some field testing with sub-elite ultra runners, testing 90 versus 120 grams an hour at 1 to 0.8 ratio,
Okay.
on a mountainous 55K course. And we found like no difference at all. Like broke it down
Okay.
into 9 different segments across 3 different loops, and we looked at GI distress. We weren't able to look at oxidation rates because it was out in the field. It was just too difficult to test. But
Yeah.
was like between those athletes was just in terms of time was no significant difference. In terms of overall time, actually the only difference was 5 minutes in total, and that was actually faster for the 90 gram group rather than the
Okay.
120 gram group.
Okay.
No
But
difference.
both were on the 1:0.8 ratio.
1 to 0.8 ratio. So we put them both
Okay.
on 1 to 0.8, and actually that would likely work against the 90 gram group, because that would only be 57.9 grams of glucose. So actually
Yep.
it might just be under those peak oxidation rates a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we might not be fully saturating SGLT1, but it might just be that, like in terms of those overall oxidation rates, they're the same anyway in terms of oxidation efficiency. Or, and again, I'm writing this through at the moment. Personally, I think the mechanisms for that, where we didn't see the difference, is more than likely the fact that at those rates, people were probably oxidizing more in the 120 group. And it was a crossover study as well. So both groups did the 90 and the 120. And then we even put a group in on that just did 90 for both. So we were able to look at that group to look at any differences in terms of weather or familiarity from day to day. It was probably the fact that the 120 group oxidized more, but all they did was displace fat oxidation. So it
Yeah.
meant in
That
the
makes a lot of
90
sense.
gram
Yeah.
group, they were running at the same intensity, but just oxidizing a little bit more fat.
Yeah. I just had a conversation with Professor Tim Noakes,
Okay,
and
yeah.
yeah, and he mentioned something like that, that the amount of glycogen that you actually start training or racing with affects the rate of oxidation of your fat.
Yeah, totally.
Something along those lines. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
Okay.
it. And that's a little bit going back to what we were saying from our lab, from the Andy King studies, that that those high rates did affect like glycogen usage early on. And again, there's other studies coming from Birmingham University to support that as well. So again, you start to take on more carbs, you start to burn more carbs, and you burn more carbs, you burn more exogenous carbs, but
Mhm.
also you will likely increase the amount of endogenous carbohydrates you use as well, which is going to be your glycogen stores.
What about the osmotic load of the fructose in a higher glucose to fructose ratio? Because fructose has even a higher osmolality than maltodextrin, for example. Is that actually managed better with the GLUT5 transporter than the SGLT1 transporters?
Yeah, definitely. Like again, the studies have shown that that 0 to 0.8 to 1 to 1 actually reduces gut issues a little bit, and that's probably likely
Okay.
to, because you're reducing that overload effect on SGLT1. So it means that there's like oxidation rates will oxidation efficiency will likely go up rather than a lot of unoxidized carbohydrates just sitting in the gut. So again, that's gonna help that for sure. But again, as soon as we start putting more fructose in as well, it's likely that that oxidation efficiency will go down. So the more we're loading up the gut with additional carbohydrates, actually we're going to get less bang for our buck. So it
Okay.
means that the amount we're oxidizing is probably going to go down as well. So that overall
Okay.
efficiency. So if we were going to take in, let's say, 90 grams an hour, and 90% of those carbs are going to get oxidized and essentially turned into energy, at let's say 120 grams or 140 grams, there's a really good study by Jenkins and Newcondrup that showed that when they took on
Okay.
142 grams an hour, which was a 1-to-1 maltodextrin to fructose ratio, actually they only oxidized 104 grams.
Okay.
So again, the oxidation efficiency went right down. So the higher we go, actually, we're probably going to oxidize less. So that gap between, like, is it worth it? Is it worth going up just for a few extra carbohydrates or not? Because actually, we're going to likely put up the fact that we've got to carry all this stuff, but but GI distress is going to likely go up at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I was just going to ask what's the downside to consuming more, even if you don't oxidize it. And yeah, I think the point
Yeah,
is you have to carry more.
exactly. Gut comfort. If you're not carrying it in your bag, then you're carrying it in your gut. And
Yeah.
also, just again, in my last study, what we saw was by the fifth hour, when people going around, well, by the sort of the fourth hour, actually, what we started to notice in the 90-gram group, it's not that people didn't get gut issues, but the gut issues weren't as severe. And actually, they tended to plateau at about sort of 4 hours, where actually in the 120-gram group, those GI issues continued to increase. So the severity got worse, people complained about it more. And actually, nausea wasn't that high, which we often see in ultras. It was more upper GI issues, so feelings of fullness, burping, things like that, regurgitation, which really showed that a lot of those carbohydrates that people were taking were just sitting in the gut.
Going back a little bit to when we talked about chasing the gels down with some water and training the gut to handle a high amount of carbohydrates, right? Two questions on that. First is microdosing those high carb products better? So instead of chucking down a huge bolus of carbohydrates at one time, dividing it, say, 30 grams every 20 minutes, and does consuming beverage with electrolytes actually help the gastric emptying?
Yeah, I'd say so. For the first question, I always try and get someone to eat every 20 minutes or 30 minutes. Like the research initially showed that like that feeding pattern improved overall oxidation rates. There's some more recent research that shows that it might not make a difference if you're
Okay.
given a larger bolus compared to kind of different feeding patterns. Actually, if you're doing a feeding pattern that was more frequently, that was every 5 minutes, actually those oxidation rates went down a little bit.
Okay.
Like the feeding pattern I choose isn't really related to oxidation rates as much. It's more related to GI distress. So again, some of that research coming out of Ricardo Costa's lab showed that by eating 20 minutes, it actually helps to increase blood flow to the gut. And again, that lack of blood flow to the gut is quite often going to be the cause of GI issues. So I try and make feed-ins regularly just to kind of keep that blood flowing. I don't always do that because it depends in certain ultras, the practicalities of a race, and that's not always practical. If someone's on a fast downhill, people can't reach food sources, things like that. It might just be get in what we can wherever we can. And then, yeah, certainly in terms of taking on gels and drinks and things like that, as you said before, like, people used to put an isotonic formulation in, but now I think I saw a gel from one company yesterday, but it's like they were pitching it was 60 grams in one gel, 60 grams of carbs, which is really, really high. So again, I would always suggest that you take some drinks in there, because what we're trying to do is in the gut, reduce that osmolality, water it
Yeah.
down essentially. So yeah, so your fluid needs are really kind of going to go up, but those fluid needs have also got to be balanced in terms of thermoregulation and what your sweat rate is as well, rather than just like essentially watering down those kind of high carbohydrate intakes.
Yeah. What about electrolytes? Does it help with the gastric emptying? Apart from replacing what you lose in your sweat.
Well, again, there's 2 points of contention there. I'd say the
Okay.
electrolyte from a available research, again, electrolytes in terms of that gastric emptying aren't really going to make any difference if you're taking in carbohydrates, particularly large amounts of carbohydrates. If you're just drinking water and not taking any fuel, then electrolytes are going to help. But why on earth would you be just drinking water and not fueling? So that's different. That's a subject for another day.
Yeah.
And then the work of Alan McCubbin, again coming out of Monash University, part of that same group. He pretty much showed that up to about 5 hours, nobody really needs electrolytes,
Okay.
apart from people who are complete outliers. So again, I'm not saying don't take electrolytes, but from what I've seen testing elite athletes and what their sweat sodium concentrations are and sweat rates are, like the more well-trained an athlete is, the lower those sodium concentrations are going to be. But also things that are going to change that is, again, level of training, the intensity that you're going to run at, the temperature you're going to run at, how heat adapted you are, what you had for your last meal, how much sodium you're taking on your drinks. So again, like, it's really, really difficult to know. And then because electrolytes are quite a hot topic at the moment, most manufacturers of sports nutrition products, regardless of whether they believe in high electrolytes or not, are shoving loads of electrolytes in their products because they know it sells, and a lot of people want more electrolytes because certain other brands have pushed them so much that actually people are getting on. So they're getting more electrolytes than they actually need.
Is there a downside to having more electrolytes though when you're
Yeah,
training and racing?
potentially. So
Okay.
again, I've got a friend who's head of a Tour de France team. What
Okay.
he noticed is when he took over his team, some of the team were getting like edemas, like swelling in their ankles and things like that. So he kind of checked everything out. He realized that they were just taking on tons of sodium. They were taking on loads of sodium through the diet.
Okay.
They were taking on loads through the sports nutrition products they were taking. They were taking additional electrolytes on top of that. So he just cut all that out. And that issue went. So it's a fact that people are taking on much more than they actually need. So it's not to say that you don't need them on a long duration race, but the likelihood is you're probably getting them. So for Tom and Ruth, again, going back to UTMB, I didn't program any electrolytes in because we didn't need them, because what we saw was their needs were really, really low. Yeah.
Okay. And they had enough in their body to sustain the race.
Yeah. And the sports nutrition products they were taking on much more than they needed anyway. So there's no need to add any extra. Again, like, let's say it's going to be hot and it's an amateur athlete and like they're going to take on a bit less nutrition products, then yeah, I'd definitely add some electrolytes then, but I wouldn't go crazy. I'd put a couple of electrolyte tabs here and there. And again, it'll help with palatability of fluid delivery and things like that as well. So it's not to cut them out completely, but there was a good study from Western states that showed two different groups in Western states. So one group who actively took electrolytes and the other that didn't. So the difference between those groups was no difference in performance. There was no difference in cramping. There was no difference in GI issues. And what they showed was the group that didn't take electrolytes likely got enough sodium intake from the foods they were taking on in Western states. So solid foods, nutrition products, taking on a handful of pretzels or nuts, you're going to get like a gram of sodium through that.
Yeah.
So it's the fact that it wasn't to say don't take on electrolytes. It was just to say that you're most likely taking on enough anyway.
From other sources during the race at aid stations.
Exactly.
Okay.
People now are doing this sort of hierarchy of needs where electrolytes are almost coming at the top. And actually, electrolytes would be right at the bottom of my list.
What's at your top of the list?
Carbohydrates, like fueling, followed shortly by hydration and fluid intake.
Well, gels or any sports nutrition products are quite expensive, and a lot of amateur runners or some amateur runners kind of want to use something from their kitchen pantry, like table sugar, honey, maple syrup could be some options. In theory, this could work because they are still glucose and fructose, but how does that translate in practice? What can go wrong for someone that is mixing honey with water or putting maple syrup in water?
There was a bit of research came out of Liverpool John Moore's uni, I think last year, that compared basically taking honey to gels, and it showed that it was just as effective. So if you've not got much money, then yeah, honey's a good way to do that. But I'd also be careful, because if you go to your local store and you buy a cheap imported honey, there was some research that showed that the people are just adding loads of sugar to it. So a lot of that is fructose. So I'd always say that go and find some local honey maker and make sure it's actually legitimate. So that's an issue.
Well, then in that case, the price of the honey goes up.
Exactly. Well. And it's really, really like where I live out on the moors, and there's lots of people who make honey from the heather. And that's like $15 a jar. And that's not going to go very far. That's quite a small jar. So it's much more expensive than Gels,
Sports nutrition,
yeah,
yeah.
maple syrup, that's not cheap, but you break down maple syrup, and again, it's just, I think the main constituent of that is it breaks down into sucrose. So again, glucose and fructose.
Yeah.
And then there's sugar as well, which you can use, which Jonathan Albon uses quite a lot. And again, a lot of the research in the past has used mixtures of glucose or maltodextrin along with sucrose and fructose, or mixtures of sucrose with fructose, because some of that research might have actually been funded by sugar companies.
Okay.
So there's some
Okay.
really good research around like liver metabolism around that. And again, it's going to break down into like 1-to-1 ratio of glucose to
Yeah.
fructose. But what I would say about that is you can't just pour it into a drink while you're running, because actually it just doesn't mix very well. So again,
Yeah.
in terms of
Yeah.
those solutes, they just don't break down as easy. So you've got to cook it up at home, so to speak. GI issues might increase taking
Yeah, because of
sucrose.
the osmolality of the glucose that is in the sucrose of table sugar that is different from maltodextrin, right?
Exactly, it's going
Yeah,
to be much higher.
much higher.
So
Yeah,
there's a greater chance of getting
GI
gut
issues.
issues, and also
Okay.
the oxidation efficiency drops down a little bit on that as well.
Yeah. Well, as we start to land the plane here, if you had one final practical takeaway for someone who is heading into their first 100K ultra race this summer, nutrition wise, what would it be?
Going back to some of the stuff I've said, so I'd hit that baseline of 60 grams an hour. If again, be adaptable though. Like some people, when things start to get a bit wobbly and the gut goes, then actually people try and stick to a plan as close as possible. Like if you back off for an hour or two, like drop your pace a little bit, like maybe just don't eat as much, take a bit of time out, your gut should sort itself out.
Settle.
Like exactly, it's worth taking a bit of time out rather than DNFing. If you stick to the plan, there's a chance it's going to get worse and you're going to withdraw from a race.
Mm-hmm.
So it should be adjustable and take time out, and it should be okay. It's a chance if you've got GI issues, it's a chance of either eaten too much, or you've drank too much, or you've drank not enough,
Okay.
or actually the heat has hit you, and it might not even be very hot. It's just that your intensity's gone up and you're really struggling
Yeah.
with thermoregulation. So if you drop your pace, if you sit out of the sun for a little bit, you let your body cool down a little bit, and you let your gut sort itself out, you'll be absolutely fine. Around that, if you're building up, thinking about now, as we're in the spring and something like most of the major race in the summer, really start to work on your gut now as well. It might just be for one day a week, you do some gut training, which you could incorporate into your long run, which would certainly improve gut tolerance, but it likely improve your long run as well in terms of reduced fatigue. You'd probably get a little bit more performance out of that long run.
Yeah.
And then a few weeks out from your race, just up that a little bit and add it to a few more runs. So prepare your gut as much as possible rather than simply preparing your muscles and your mind.
Yeah.
And that'll all feed in, no pun intended, but also it'll help give you that confidence as well, and experiment with different gels and drinks and foods as much as possible. Think about what's available at UTMB, like what brands are going to be available, what products, what solid foods they've got there as well, and just really build up to that. And then do a bit of DIY testing, like look what some of your sweat rates are, as I say, check different brands and things like that, and really kind of build it into that overall plan.
My closing question for you, Paul, is what does endurance mean to you?
Endurance, for me personally, just getting to the end of it now at my age, like performance times have gone out the window. It's just, can I endure this? So again, like more, it's just as much of a battle as your mind and it is your body, and keep your head in it, particularly late on in an ultra. Can you muster up, like, your body? For most people, your body's still got what it takes to run, but it's your mind that's telling you to stop. So again, it's what can you actually endure out there?
Thank you, Paul.
Great, thank you.